On a crisp, clear Tuesday morning in September, the world as we knew it ended in a matter of 102 minutes. For many, it began with the mundane sights and sounds of a typical New York rush hour, the hum of the city, and a sky so blue it felt infinite. Then came the sound that would haunt a generation, the roar of low-flying engines slicing through the silence of lower Manhattan. In an instant, the symbols of American economic and military might were transformed into pillars of fire and ash. We all remember where we were when the first tower fell, but decades later, the question remains, do we truly understand the sequence of events that reshaped the global landscape forever? This is not just a retelling of a tragedy, it is an investigation into the mechanics of a failure, the anatomy of a plot, and the stories of those who lived through the impossible. The operation was years in the making, born in the remote training camps of Afghanistan and refined in the quiet suburbs of Germany and Florida. It was a plan that relied on the very freedoms and logistical efficiencies that defined the Western world. To understand what really happened, we have to look back at the late 90s, when intelligence agencies began picking up chatter that was increasingly urgent but tragically fragmented. There were warnings of a Hiroshima-style event and reports of suspicious individuals enrolling in flight schools, yet the dots remained unconnected. The hijackers weren't ghosts, they were men who moved through airport security, rented cars and paid taxes, hiding in plain sight while preparing to use commercial airliners as guided missiles. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. Initially, many thought it was a freak accident, a navigation error, or a mechanical failure. But 17 minutes later, the illusion of an accident vanished. United Airlines Flight 175 curved over the New York harbor and slammed into the South Tower on live television, confirming to a stunned global audience that the United States was under attack. While the eyes of the world were fixed on the burning skyscrapers of Manhattan, a third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, was being steered toward the heart of the nation's defense. At 9:37 a.m., it struck the Pentagon, tearing through the concrete rings of the world's largest office building. Inside the towers, the situation was a chaotic battle for survival. Thousands of people were trapped above the impact zones, their escape routes severed by severed elevator cables and burning jet fuel. We now know that the temperatures reached levels that weakened the structural steel, leading to a progressive collapse that few engineers had ever envisioned. Below the impact sites, people descended dark, smoky stairwells, guided by the bravery of first responders who were climbing upward into a certain death. The heroism of the FDNY and NYPD that day cannot be overstated. They rushed toward the danger while everyone else was running away, fueled by a duty that transcended self-preservation. Perhaps the most visceral chapter of the morning took place in the skies over Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 was the fourth hijacked aircraft, believed to be headed for the United States Capitol or the White House. However, the passengers on this flight received news of the other attacks via airphones. Realizing that their plane was also intended to be a weapon, they did something unprecedented. They took a vote. In the final minutes of their lives, these ordinary citizens became soldiers, storming the cockpit to prevent further slaughter. Their sacrifice at 10:03 a.m. in a field near Shanksville remains one of the most profound acts of defiance in American history. As the dust settled over the wreckage of Ground Zero, a new era began. The physical scars were deep, but the psychological impact was even greater. The United States transitioned into a state of permanent vigilance, giving birth to the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA, and sparking a global war on terror that would span 2 decades. We have spent years analyzing the intelligence failures, the structural vulnerabilities of the buildings, and the geopolitical shifts that followed. But beyond the politics and the blueprints, what really happened on 9/11 was a testament to human resilience. In the face of calculated cruelty, the world saw a spontaneous outpouring of courage, unity, and a refusal to be broken. Understanding 9/11 means honoring those who were lost by ensuring that the truth of that day is never obscured by time or rhetoric.
To understand the sheer scale of the intelligence breakdown, we must look at the years leading up to the morning of the attack. It was a period characterized by what investigators later called a failure of imagination. For much of the 1990s, the threat of terrorism was viewed through the lens of traditional car bombings or localized attacks on overseas embassies. The idea that a terrorist organization could coordinate a multi-pronged aerial assault using domestic airliners as kinetic weapons was dismissed as the plot of a Hollywood thriller, not a viable national security threat. Yet, the evidence was mounting. In the caves of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was issuing fatwas against the United States, and in the bustling cities of Europe, a cell of radicalized students was forming the backbone of the operation. The Hamburg cell, led by Mohammed Atta, became the operational core. These were not men who grew up in poverty or isolation. They were educated, tech-savvy, and capable of blending into Western society. They moved to the United States and began the process of infiltrating the very systems they intended to destroy. Throughout 2000 and 2001, these individuals enrolled in American flight schools, specifically requesting training on large commercial jets, while showing a chilling lack of interest in learning how to take off or land. Despite several red flags raised by flight instructors who felt something was off, the decentralized nature of American intelligence meant that these reports rarely made it to the desks of those who could act on them. The wall between the FBI and the CIA proved to be a fatal barrier. The CIA was tracking known al-Qaeda operatives globally, while the FBI was responsible for domestic investigations. Because of strict legal barriers intended to protect civil liberties, the two agencies often failed to share critical data. We now know that two of the hijackers, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, were identified by the CIA as having attended a terrorist summit in Malaysia. When they entered the United States on valid visas, the CIA did not immediately notify the FBI that these dangerous individuals were now on American soil. For months, they lived openly in San Diego, even listed in the local phone book, while the agencies tasked with finding them remained in the dark. By August 2001, the system was blinking red. Top-level officials were receiving briefings titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S.," yet the focus remained on overseas interests. There was a profound lack of urgency in securing the domestic aviation system. Airport security at the time was largely privatized and focused on detecting metal weapons like guns or large knives. The hijackers exploited this by using small box cutters and pocket knives, which were permitted under the regulations of the time. They also relied on the standard hijacking protocol of the era, which advised pilots and crew to cooperate with hijackers in hopes of landing safely and negotiating. They used our own safety procedures against us, turning a hostage situation into a suicide mission. The timeline of the morning itself reveals a terrifying precision. While the public saw the towers burning, behind the scenes, air traffic controllers were witnessing a nightmare unfold on their radar screens. One by one, transponders were being turned off, turning massive passenger jets into ghost planes that were nearly impossible to track in the crowded corridors of the Northeast. The chaos in the air was mirrored by the chaos on the ground, as decision-makers struggled to grasp the magnitude of a threat that was evolving faster than their ability to communicate. As the first tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m., it sent a shockwave through the engineering world. The South Tower, which had been hit second, fell first. This was due to the speed and angle of United 175, which had sliced through the corner of the building, compromising more structural columns than the first impact. The collapse was a result of a pancake effect, where the intense heat of the jet fuel fire, though not hot enough to melt the steel, was more than enough to weaken it to the point of failure. When the support trusses gave way, the weight of the upper floors came crashing down, creating a momentum that no structure on Earth could withstand. It was a mechanical catastrophe that turned a skyscraper into a vertical graveyard in less than 15 seconds.
The collapse of the North Tower at 10:28 a.m. signaled the total transformation of Lower Manhattan into a landscape that resembled a war zone more than a financial district. A massive debris cloud composed of pulverized concrete, gypsum, and hazardous fibers raced through the canyons of the city, swallowing everything in its path. For those who survived the initial collapse, the struggle moved from the stairwells to the streets. The air was thick with a toxic gray dust that made breathing nearly impossible, and a haunting silence fell over the area, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of hundreds of pass alarms, small devices worn by firefighters that go off when a person remains motionless for too long. Each chirp represented a life buried beneath the mountains of twisted steel. The forensic challenge that lay ahead was unprecedented in human history. Ground Zero was not just a recovery site, it was a crime scene of massive proportions. Investigators had to sift through 1.8 million tons of debris to find evidence that could link the attacks to specific individuals and organizations. Amidst the carnage, researchers found remarkably preserved artifacts: a charred passport belonging to one of the hijackers, flight recorders from some of the aircraft, and personal belongings that told the stories of the victims. This painstaking process took months as teams worked 24 hours a day under the glare of floodlights, driven by a desperate need for answers and the duty to return remains to grieving families. While the physical debris was being cleared, the digital and financial trails were being mapped out by intelligence agencies across the globe. Investigators tracked the flow of money from bank accounts in the Middle East to the hijackers' accounts in Florida and New Jersey. They discovered that the entire operation had cost al-Qaeda between $400,000 and $500,000, a relatively small sum that had managed to cause billions of dollars in damage and change the course of history. The trail led back to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the self-proclaimed architect of the 9/11 attacks, and confirmed that the planning had been centralized in the rugged borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden was being sheltered by the Taliban. The geopolitical response was swift and total. Within weeks, the United States invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty for the first time in NATO history, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. The focus shifted to Afghanistan, where the mission was clear: dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the regime that provided them safe haven. But as the military campaign began, the domestic landscape of the United States was also changing. The passage of the Patriot Act and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security represented the most significant reorganization of the American government in over half a century. The balance between national security and individual privacy became a central debate, one that continues to define American legal and social discourse to this very day. In the shadows of the larger conflict, a deeper medical crisis was beginning to emerge. The first responders and volunteers who spent months breathing in the dust of Ground Zero began to fall ill with rare cancers, respiratory diseases, and chronic conditions now known as World Trade Center syndrome. The sacrifice of these individuals didn't end on September 11th. It continued for decades as they fought for medical recognition and support. Their struggle highlighted a grim reality. The true death toll of the attacks was not a static number from a single day, but a rising figure that grew as the long-term effects of the environment took hold. As the years passed, the site of the World Trade Center was rebuilt, but the void left by the original Twin Towers remained a permanent fixture in the collective memory. The construction of the One World Trade Center and the 9/11 Memorial and Museum served as symbols of resilience, but they also served as reminders of the fragility of peace. The events of that day forced a fundamental shift in how the world viewed security, travel, and international relations. It was a day that proved that in an interconnected world, a small group of determined individuals could exploit the very systems that made modern life possible. The hunt for the architect of the attacks, Osama bin Laden, became the most extensive and expensive manhunt in human history. It was a search that spanned rugged mountain ranges, deep underground bunkers, and high-tech urban hideouts. In the early stages of the war in Afghanistan, during the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, it was believed that bin Laden was cornered. However, due to a reliance on local militia forces and a failure to commit enough American ground troops to seal the border, he vanished into the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan. For the next decade, he became a shadow, a figure who communicated through occasional video and audio tapes, taunting the West while the world's most powerful military struggled to pinpoint his exact location. While the physical search continued, the American cultural landscape was undergoing a profound transformation. The initial surge of unity and patriotism that saw flags flying from every porch began to give way to a complex era of anxiety and suspicion. The introduction of the color-coded Homeland Security Advisory System kept the public in a state of constant low-level dread. Travel was fundamentally altered. The once casual experience of walking to an airport gate became a process of checkpoints, scans, and the removal of shoes, a permanent reminder that the world was no longer a safe playground. This era also saw a rise in Islamophobia, as a grieving and angry nation often struggled to distinguish between the radical ideology of a few and the faith of billions. Deep inside the intelligence community, a new approach was taking shape. The focus shifted from traditional surveillance to a massive global data collection effort. The National Security Agency began monitoring trillions of digital communications, searching for patterns that could indicate the next plot. This big data approach to counterterrorism was controversial, sparking intense debates about the Fourth Amendment and the right to privacy. Yet the justification was always the same: another 9/11 must be prevented at all costs. This period saw the rise of drone warfare, a method of targeted killing that allowed the United States to strike its enemies from thousands of miles away, fundamentally changing the ethics and the visibility of combat. As the years stretched into a decade, the trail for bin Laden went cold several times. It wasn't until 2010 that intelligence analysts at the CIA began to focus on a specific courier known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. By tracking his movements, they were led not to a cave or a mountain hut, but to a massive, high-walled compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, just a mile away from the country's premier military academy. The compound was an anomaly. It had no telephone or internet connection, and the residents burned their trash instead of putting it out for collection. Intelligence officers used satellite imagery to observe a tall man walking in the garden, whom they nicknamed the Pacer. On the night of May 1, 2011, under the cover of total darkness, 2 modified Black Hawk helicopters carrying 24 Navy SEALs crossed the border from Afghanistan into Pakistani airspace. The mission, known as Operation Neptune Spear, was a high-stakes gamble. One of the helicopters crashed during the landing, but the SEALs proceeded with clinical precision. In a matter of minutes, they breached the compound walls, moved through the house, and located bin Laden on the 3rd floor. The The phrase Geronimo EKIA, enemy killed in action, echoed back to the White House Situation Room, bringing a definitive end to a chapter that had begun 10 years earlier. But the legacy of 9/11 had already been etched into the foundations of the 21st century. The Iraq War, launched in 2003 under the premise of eliminating weapons of mass destruction and breaking ties with al-Qaeda, had further complicated the geopolitical map, leading to a decade of sectarian violence and the eventual rise of groups like ISIS. The cost of these conflicts, both in terms of trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives lost, remains a subject of intense scrutiny and reflection. The 9/11 era proved that while an individual leader could be eliminated, the ideas and the global instability sparked on that September morning were far more difficult to contain. The reconstruction of the World Trade Center site became a slow and symbolic process of healing. Every design choice, from the height of One World Trade Center at 1,776 feet to the reflecting absence waterfalls in the footprints of the original towers, was intended to honor the past while looking toward the future. The names of the 2,977 victims are etched in bronze, arranged not alphabetically, but by meaningful adjacencies, grouping friends, colleagues, and family members together as they were in life. This attention to detail reflects the enduring human need to find order and beauty in the wake of senseless destruction.
The long-term health crisis following the collapse of the towers is perhaps the most enduring and tragic chapter of the 9/11 story. When the buildings fell, they didn't just disappear, they were pulverized into a microscopic, toxic slurry. The dust contained a deadly cocktail of asbestos, lead, mercury, dioxins, and glass fibers, along with jet fuel and the remains of thousands of lives. In the days following the attack, officials from the Environmental Protection Agency famously stated that the air was safe to breathe, a claim that would later be proven catastrophically wrong. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, construction workers, and volunteers who spent months on the pile, often without adequate respiratory protection, were inhaling a slow-acting poison. Today, the number of people who have died from 9/11-related illnesses, including rare respiratory cancers and interstitial lung disease, has surpassed the number of people killed on the day of the attacks itself. This ongoing medical disaster forced the creation of the World Trade Center Health Program and the Victim Compensation Fund, reminding us that for many, the towers are still falling. As the years turned into decades, the demand for transparency regarding what the government knew grew louder. Families of the victims fought tirelessly for the declassification of the so-called 28 pages from the original joint inquiry. These documents explored potential links between the hijackers and foreign entities, specifically looking into the logistical and financial support networks that might have assisted the terrorists while they were living in the United States. The eventual release of these documents and subsequent declassifications by the executive branch revealed a complex web of connections that painted a far more detailed picture of the pre-9/11 world. It showed a landscape where radical ideologies were sometimes overlooked in the name of diplomatic stability, and where the trail of money led through various charitable organizations and private individuals. These revelations didn't just provide closure, they sparked new legal battles and redefined the conversation about accountability on the global stage. The technological legacy of 9/11 is also woven into the fabric of our daily lives. The sensors, cameras, and facial recognition software that now monitor public spaces in major cities were accelerated by the security requirements of the post-9/11 world. The Ring of Steel in Lower Manhattan became a blueprint for urban security worldwide. Even our digital footprints are a product of this era. The shift from human intelligence to signals intelligence changed how we interact with technology, as the balance between convenience and surveillance shifted.
We now live in an era where the anticipation of a threat is constant, and the infrastructure of safety is invisible but ever present. This systemic change has had a profound effect on the American psyche, creating a society that is more connected yet more guarded than ever before. In the final analysis, what really happened on 9/11 was a collision between the 20th and 21st centuries. It was the moment the world realized that geographical borders and massive military budgets were no longer absolute shields against decentralized threats. It taught us about the resilience of the human spirit, seen in the boat lift that evacuated 500,000 people from Manhattan in the largest sea evacuation in history, larger even than Dunkirk. It showed us the power of community in the thousands of people who lined up to give blood and the millions who donated to help families they would never meet. But it also served as a harsh lesson in the cost of complacency. The failures of 9/11 were not just failures of intelligence or security, but a failure to believe that such a horrific event was possible in a modern civilized world. Today, as we look at the skyline of New York, the absence of the Twin Towers is still felt by those who knew them, but the presence of the new World Trade Center complex stands as a testament to the fact that while buildings can be destroyed, the values they represent are far more durable. The lessons learned are written in the blood of the victims and the sweat of the rescuers. They remind us that vigilance requires not just better technology, but better communication and empathy. As we move further away from that Tuesday morning in 9/11, the responsibility shifts to the next generation to remember not just the fire and the dust, but the truth of the events that led to it and the strength that emerged from the ruins. This is the ultimate narrative of 9/11, a story of a day that changed everything, and a world that, despite the scars, refused to stay broken.
The stories of the four flights, American 11, United 175, American 77, and United 93, are more than just a sequence of tragic timelines. They are a collection of final phone calls, whispered I love yous, and the sudden, breathtaking courage of ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary nightmare. On Flight 93, the passengers weren't just victims, they were the first counterattack in the War on Terror. By choosing to fight back, they saved the U.S. Capitol and countless lives on the ground, proving that even in the face of certain death, the human will to protect others remains our most powerful weapon. These individual stories of bravery remind us that while the attacks were designed to create a sense of powerlessness, they instead revealed a strength that no amount of violence could ever truly extinguish. As we look back at the mechanics of that day, the intelligence gaps, the structural vulnerabilities, and the geopolitical shifts, it is easy to get lost in the cold facts and the vast numbers. But the real truth of what happened on 9/11 isn't found in the blueprints or the security reports. It's found in the days that followed, when the world seemed to stop, and for a brief moment we all looked at each other with a renewed sense of shared humanity. We saw it in the thousands of volunteers who traveled across the country to clear debris, the neighborhoods that held candlelight vigils, and the strangers who comforted one another on the streets of a grieving city. It was a time when the things that divided us, politics, religion, and background, seemed insignificant compared to the simple fact that we were all in this together. 25 years later, the legacy of 9/11 lives on in the children of the victims who have grown up to become first responders themselves, in the memorials that dot the landscape of our nation, and in the increased security that protects our travels. We have learned that safety is not a static state, but a constant effort, and that freedom requires a vigilance that goes beyond just watching the skies. We have also learned the importance of historical truth, that we must look clearly at our failures so that we might better safeguard our future.
The documentary of 9/11 is still being written every time we choose unity over fear, and every time we honor the memory of those lost by building a world that is more resilient and more compassionate than the one that was attacked. As the sun sets over the Hudson River and reflects off the glass of the New World Trade Center, we are reminded that light always follows the darkest of mornings. The skyline has changed, and so have we. We carry the scars of that day not as a sign of weakness, but as a badge of endurance. We remember the names, we honor the sacrifices, and we move forward with the knowledge that while a single morning can change the course of history, it cannot change the character of a people determined to stand tall. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the truth of what really happened. By remembering, we ensure that the spirit of those we lost continues to guide us toward a brighter, more secure tomorrow.